May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Gook Audio podcast. I'm DC Booba of Gook Audio and Gook Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today we have 3 draft pieces for a work in progress: Tassajara Stories, The Early Years with Shunryu Suzuki. I'll start reading that as soon as we've had our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause if you wish, and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish. And when you're through and ready to come back, hit unpause, and we'll all come back at the same time, and we'll hit the bell to end the meditation or whatever, and get into reading more Tassajara Stories. Fred Kimball. On the way to Texas, Bob, Mary, and I spent an afternoon with psychic Fred Kimball, whom I'd seen a few times before. I'd met him when I first came to California because a family friend told me he was one of the best psychics in America. Fred didn't ask questions to learn anything about you and wasn't mercenary. Charged only $25 for an hour reading. That day, we spent 3 hours with him, got personal readings, and then ran names by him to get his hit on people. I said, Reb. Fred paused a moment and said, "Boy, is that guy ambitious. He ought to get a motorcycle and ride it up mountains." Reb turned that ambition toward practice. Ruthie. She's got a lot of energy spilling out all over. She's one person that definitely ought to be doing your meditation. That was interesting because she was the one person there who didn't go to Zazen, as she was there as a spouse. She did tons of work, though, especially in the garden. Richard. Now there's somebody who can get knocked down 3 times and get up. Most people stop at 1 or 2. That's interesting coming from Fred. Fred used to be a wrestler and a boxer. Kelly. That's what people called my father. His name was Kelroy, which he didn't like. Fred didn't get an immediate hit. Put his hand on his forehead for a moment, looked up and said, "Has this person died?" I said, "Yes. They don't like to be bothered, and I'm no good at that," he said. There are people who are good at that." I told him to go on and try. He said, "Kelly, appreciate the courtesy of your picking up the phone." He waited a minute and said, "You got to make sure you get the right person. I see a big radio. Does that mean anything?" I told him yes, that my father had a shortwave radio, and it was big. He says he took good care of his wife and kids. worked too much, had more fun when he was younger. Says he was too interested in religion, spent too much time on it. That's my father. He would sit and read the Bible and New Thought Christian books and pamphlets and the motivational and self-help books, TNT, The Power Within You. He asked if he can go now. I said, sure. Resisting the impulse to have hurt feelings as a result of this mysterious exchange. And I thought about how my life has led me to be with people with that same sort of drive. Back when I'd first met Fred, I asked him about Suzuki. He's not having sex. That's not good. I have sex every day with my wife. But he says he's found what he's looking for. He's satisfied, so okay. People come to him and say, why am I unhappy? And he says, because you want too much. Then I told him he was my Zen teacher. Fred said he'd done Zazen with Nyogen Shinzaki in L.A. After the man who hosted Shinzaki's sittings drowned in his swimming pool, Fred married the widow, Marion. Zen, he said with disdain. What's the sound of one hand clapping and all that crap? Then he looked at me and said, let's see what you really think about it. Almost immediately he said, you like it. Say it's working for you. And then there, see, you scratched your right cheek. That confirms it. One thing that changed because of that meeting is that Mary stopped doing Zazen. She'd always sit with us when we sat. She'd done a 1-week sesshin in full lotus without moving at Zen Center. Suzuki told me she was an older student from the day she arrived. But she had another insight-type spiritual practice that she'd been involved with for years. She didn't say anything to Fred about herself, just sat there right off. He said, you can't practice 2 religions. You've got to choose one. Bob and I sat alone on the trip after that. Later, Suzuki asked me where Mary was, and I said she had another spiritual practice and had decided just to be a friend of Zenny's and not practice with us. Sorry, Roshi, you'll have to settle for me. You have your good points, he said. Watkins. We looked up tall, red-bearded Bob and short, sweet Sandy Watkins in Studio City. Halpern and I told them how much we missed them at Tassajara. They'd been so helpful that first year. Bob was Tassajara's first work leader. Sandy was in the garden. Watkins was a decade older than Sandy and us. He'd been in the Korean War. He'd been involved in the movie business on the logistics end, had a long-time association with Dennis Hopper. He said one task he had for a while was to bring Frank Sinatra a fifth of vodka every morning. With earnings from a trip to and from Mexico via sailboat, he had bought a truck and fitted it with a camper that was their snug home. There were lots of little drawers and boxes with essentials perfectly packed, including grains, nuts, dried fruit. They were strict vegans back in a time when that was more of a rarity. They had driven the 51 Chevy into Tassajara during a snowstorm in the winter of '67. In the lower parts, it was raining and the road was slippery, and back then, in far worse condition than at any other time in our history with it. Watkins said he kept sliding into the side of the mountain to avoid sliding off the side. He remembered when I came to stay, and when Halpern first came walking in with a heavy backpack on a trail from the coast. He remembered fondly my culinary skills. I got into testing what I'd learned at Loring's and was making weird conglomerations of gruel and casseroles and bread. And Bob and Sandy Watkins were the most appreciative of those experiments. Watkins had dug footings to pour the foundations for a new stone kitchen. He said, "We were digging and I was down in this ditch with a pick and here comes Suzuki Roshi." I said, "Gee, I waited all this time to meet a real Zen master and I can't think of a thing to ask or anything." I was totally blanked out. I wasn't embarrassed or confused. In fact, I was surprised. It was like somebody reached up and turned off the lights. There wasn't anything to say. And he laughed and went on. Watkins reminded us how Suzuki and Hankhangiri would sometimes wear white gloves when they worked. That's common in Japan. Reminded him of Mickey Mouse. One of Suzuki's one-liners, he said, that I really applied a lot in my life was "just do it." Just do it was like this little island in my stream. Sandy and I came out of high desert where we'd been isolated for a couple of years, and I see a kid on the streets one day with a T-shirt on it that said, "Just do it." It blew my mind. Another one was "little by little." He used it like it's how things happen, how you can accomplish something. Little by little you can do it. Roshi and I both had a sweet tooth, he said, and sometimes after last sitting period he would come to my cabin and sit on this stump by my bed and pull some candy from his sleeve. We would eat candy and talk for about 10 or 20 minutes. Those times were wonderful. Watkins had shaved his head like so many of the men at Tassajara at that time, but not his long red beard. One night after sitting, we were watching the full moon, which was very bright, and he said, "Heads, minds, moons, all shining." You remember that Ruthie used to pick yucca flowers and we would eat them in our salads? Some of the leaves had fallen off and the base of the leaf was kind of frayed. Suzuki Roshi said it would make a great sumi brush, so I grabbed a handful of them and he made up some sumi ink and he did 2 pieces of calligraphy and gave them to me, and one of them is hanging in the other room and one of them is put away. One of them says, "Everything is absolutely perfect." And he signed it and put Tassajara Zen Shinshi, 1967. And the other one was 2 characters that said "pure wind." Do you remember how he used to use the word pure a lot? If you get up from Zazen and leave the Zendo in that frame of mind, that's what he called pure action. Without thinking, you just do it. The Nike slogan. If you just do it, it's Shikantaza. It's the same attitude that you had in the Zendo, and he used to refer to that as pure practice. So he did a few things on the newspaper and started giggling and got real happy and got out some good white paper and did those 2 pieces of calligraphy, and then he laughed and gave those to me and said, "Now don't tell anybody." In other words, what I use for a brush. And then years later, I'm here in New Mexico and I get this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and there's this calligraphy on the book cover, and it had to be made with those yucca leaves. We were working on that wall under the dining room, and a couple of guys were talking about something, and we were down underneath the bridge, and just as they crossed the bridge, one of them said, "Don't make any waves, don't make any waves." And Suzuki Roshi said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "Don't make more of it than it is. Don't excite the situation, let it be." And he went, "Oh." And he went ahead working. And that evening he used it in a lecture. Suzuki got a lot of material that way. The Just Do It might have come to Suzuki the same way. He would pick up cues from us and was creative, but his teaching and stories and examples were largely from the massive Chinese and Japanese Buddhist and artistic storehouses of wisdom. Watkins would ask questions in lectures that showed he knew something about Buddhism before he came, but he'd pronounce the Sanskrit words wrong like he'd never heard them. I asked him about that. He said it was because he just read by himself and never studied with anyone. I asked what's his story. He said, nothing much, but I pried. Looking back in time from my viewpoint now is that everything is perfect, as Suzuki Roshi said. I spent my first 9 years with my father's mother, who was in her 70s, way back in the woods. In rapid time, there were boarding schools, military, Catholic, etc., then a few years on the streets in L.A. with my aunt. Then the airborne at 16, out a few years, then in prison 3 years where I read everything I could get on Buddhism. Bob was lucky it was only 3 years. He was in there for armed robbery. The getaway driver said they never hurt anyone, but a guy had a gun and that stuck with them all. I took a pencil, he said, and made a dot the size of a dime on the wall of my cell and then sat in front of it until things went away. Tried corpse asana, lying down, but it was too much like a trance. Finally, I got hold of D.T. Suzuki book and saw there was a school of sitting. Then I heard of a place near Big Sur and found Tassajara. That's it. I told Sandy that one good result of them leaving would be she'd be able to get further away from Poison Oak, which it seemed would infect her from the wind. I always called Poison Oak Tassajara public enemy number 1, and her Poison Oak victim number 1. Everyone wanted them to stay, but they moved on in the fall. Baker was mad at Bob for leaving. They were more savvy than most of us, and we appreciated their maturity and experience. Suzuki told them, you may leave the monastery, but the monastery won't leave you. The Han. Hankhangiri was at Tassajara for the practice period to be a translator for Tatsugami. That was a lot of work. Tatsugami gave a lot of long lectures and only stopped for translation every 15 minutes or so. Hankhangiri would take a few minutes to sum it up, and Tatsugami would start up again. And Tatsugami would meet with officers and the doans who took care of the zendo in ceremonies and with groups of students. Dan was a great help, but the burden of it fell on Hankhangiri, who did his duty. He was so earnest. He had a strong sense of responsibility, and exemplar, yet humble. He was strict with himself in a non-judgmental way so that students felt comfortable around him and encouraged. In practice situations, he maintained good form. If he were on a picnic, he'd loosen up, be more outwardly friendly, joke with people. He tended to be relaxed alone with me because he'd known me longer in various situations. I might be with him walking, and when some other students came up, he'd immediately adjust his posture, get more formal. There was this solemnity never far in our practice, but it was flexible. One day off, when Bob and I had been joking around, I saw Hankhangiri coming across the bridge by the dorm with 4 students. I thought they looked awfully somber for a 4 and 9 day, and before I could stop myself, I leaped out in front of them and belted out as if I were on stage. I hate Zen, even though it is my friend, just can't win. It follows me until the end. Now, some say it's wrong, and some say it's right, and some say it's uptight, some out of sight, but I hate Zen, even though it is my friend, that's right, even though it is my friend. With that last line, I danced off behind the side of a cabin and ran into the back, so maybe they'd wonder if that had just happened. I told Katagiri I wanted to study the kanji of the Heart Sutra, another chants we recited. He suggested I start with something short and work my way up to longer pieces. Usually when I stood in front of the Han, I was there to hit it with a wooden mallet, announcing time for zazen. The pattern of strikes takes 15 minutes. Lift the mallet out of the rope loop that hangs from the bottom of the Han. 3 introductory strikes, well spaced. Then 7 ending with a roll down and a punctuating hit. Next round, 5 strikes, a roll down and 2 hits, light then strong. And the third round for the abbot or doshi, the officer arriving at the end to offer incense at the altar with the final 3 strong, light, strong strikes penetrating into the zendo. This time I stood before the Han, however, was not before zazen, and I was not holding the mallet, but a pen, copying the characters from the Chinese poem on its face. I couldn't get some that were in the middle where the mallet strikes because it had created a crater with the mandala of small flat splinters. Paul Disco had made the Han up in the shop, cutting 2 feet from a 2.5-inch thick, 1.5 wide oak slab. The slab was one of a number that were sliced up a couple of years before by 2 friends of his with a 2-person chainsaw mill with rip-cut teeth. Sometimes it takes a couple of years for the battered Han to break. We heard the monks had a party in Japan when that happened, but I don't remember us doing that. Han is just a word for wood, not the one that's used in modern spoken and written Japanese. It's what the Japanese made of the Chinese sound long ago. It was common knowledge Han meant wood, but not the meaning of most the kanji on the Han. When asked what it meant, Suzuki had just said, "Don't goof off." I went to Katagiri's cabin. He looked at what I had written, grimaced, opened a book, and wrote the characters all out clearly, enunciating how they were to be pronounced. I told him I'd find out what I could about the meaning of those kanji, and if he would be so kind, I'd come talk to him about it later when I knew more. He nodded and gashoed. I had a stack of reference books I'd bought in San Francisco. The one I used first was the large Nelson's Kanji Dictionary. I loved the book. It was so thorough. That spring I wrote down every character in it and looked into other things we chanted, usually staying up late with the blanket covering the window so the fire watch wouldn't tell me, "Lights out." The regular Kinkyusha Japanese English and vice versa dictionary was sometimes useful, but often not. This was old stuff I was looking at. I had Chinese and Japanese to English Buddhist dictionaries that were helpful, but not at all complete. Serious students of those classical Buddhist texts were beyond using books with English. After going over the meaning of the kanji on the Han with Katagiri and later with Yoshimura, I had a pretty good idea what the poem said. There are 4 lines with 4 characters each. Like even most Japanese monks, I didn't know how the Chinese pronounced the lines, but I knew how the Japanese read it, and that was with somewhat different order and more words because they throw in connecting words and some implied in the Chinese. The kanji in the first line were easy ones: life, death, big thing. What comes across is more like life and death is the great matter. The next line had two compound words meaning something like transient, fleeting. Then four kanji that meant to pay attention, and the last Hankhangiri and I worked out to be respectfully, don't be dissolute, which doesn't come across well, so we agreed on don't waste this life. After that, every time I heard the Han hit, I heard those words: thump, life and death are the great matter. Thump, it goes by fast. Thump, pay attention to this. Thump, don't waste this life. And I know why Hankhangiri was so resolute. He took those words seriously, and he wanted us to do that too. This has been a Cuke Audio podcast. I'm D.C. Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Doggett Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you, and yours, and all of us, a grand awakening.